The streets above the cisterns were alive with commerce. Constantinople was the trading hub of the medieval world in a way that no other city could match, because the geography put it at the intersection of every major trade route that connected Europe to Asia. Silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, grain from Egypt, wine from the Aegean Islands, amber from the Baltic. The goods of half the world passed through the harbours and the warehouses and the markets of Constantinople. And the taxes on that trade funded the army and the navy and the administration and the building programs that kept the empire functioning. The currency was stable. The Byzantine gold solidus, first minted by Constantine, remained the standard unit of international trade for over 700 years, accepted and trusted from Britain to China, the dollar of the medieval world, the coin against which all other currencies were measured. The stability of the currency was both a cause and a consequence of the stability of the state, a circular relationship that kept the economy functioning as long as both elements held, and that would contribute to the eventual decline when confidence in either was shaken. The bureaucracy was enormous and efficient, a professional civil service that managed the affairs of an empire with the systematic thoroughness that the Roman administrative tradition had developed over centuries, and that Byzantium refined into something approaching a modern state. Apparatus, tax collection, legal proceedings, military logistics, diplomatic correspondence, the thousand details of governing a complex, multilingual, geographically dispersed empire were handled by trained professionals who entered government service through competitive examination and advanced through a hierarchy that rewarded competence alongside connections. The army, when properly funded and properly led, was the most sophisticated military force in the medieval world. It used combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and naval forces according to written military manuals that were studied and updated across the centuries, a tradition of professional military education that the Western kingdoms did not develop until much later. The Byzantine generals read strategy the way their counterparts in the West read scripture, as a body of accumulated wisdom that could be studied and applied and adapted to changing circumstances. And binding all of it together, providing the ideological framework within which everything else operated, was the faith. Orthodox Christianity was not just the religion of Constantinople, it was the identity of Constantinople, the relationship between the emperor and the patriarch, between secular power and religious authority, was the axis around which the entire civilization rotated. The emperor was God's representative on earth, the patriarch was the guardian of God's truth. The relationship between them was sometimes harmonious and sometimes contentious, and always the most important political relationship in the empire, more important than any military alliance or any commercial treaty, because it determined the terms on which everything else was understood. There is a city that has been the capital of the world 3 times. Not a capital. The capital, the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. The place where power lived and decisions were made, and the future was determined for millions of people who would never see its walls or walk its streets, but whose lives were shaped down to the smallest detail by what happened inside them. It has had 3 names. The first name was Byzantium, a Greek colony on a promontory where the waters of the Black Sea narrow into a strait so strategically positioned that the person who told the founders where to build it was, according to legend, following the instruction of an oracle who said simply, "Build opposite the blind." The blind the oracle meant were the people who had already built a city on the other side of the strait and failed to notice that the promontory across the water was the better site. The better site by so great a margin that the mistake of the blind would echo for 26 centuries. The second name was Constantinople, given by a Roman emperor who understood, with the particular strategic clarity of a man who had spent his life in the business of holding an empire together, that the center of that empire was no longer Rome, that the future was in the east, that the place where Europe meets Asia, where the Mediterranean meets the Black Sea, where the trade routes of 3 continents converge on a single point of land surrounded on 3 sides by water, that this place was where the capital of the world needed to be. He put his name on it. He moved the empire. He changed everything. The third name is Istanbul, given by the people who finally took the city after it had resisted conquest for over 1,000 years, after it had survived more sieges than any other city in the history of the world, after its walls had held against armies that outnumbered its defenders by margins that should have made defense impossible. They took it in 1453 on a Tuesday in May, and the world that had existed on the morning of that Tuesday was not the world that existed on the evening of it. 3 names, 3 empires, 26 centuries of continuous habitation on a triangle of land less than 7 miles long, a place so coveted and so fought over that the list of people who tried to take it reads like a catalogue of every major military power of the last 2 millennia. The Persians tried, the Arabs tried, twice, with enormous fleets that retreated in flames. The Vikings tried, the Bulgars tried, the Crusaders, the people who were supposed to be the city's allies, succeeded in a betrayal so complete that the city never fully recovered from it. A betrayal that still shapes the relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity to this day. And finally, the Ottomans succeeded with cannons that were the largest the world had ever built, aimed at walls that had held for 1,000 years and that fell not because the walls were weak, but because the world had changed around them, and the thing that had always protected them was no longer enough. If you have flown into Istanbul, you have seen it from the air, the triangle of the old city, the Golden Horn curving along its northern edge, the Bosphorus flowing past its eastern point, the Sea of Marmara stretching south, the domes and minarets rising from the promontory, the bridges connecting Europe and Asia across a strait so narrow you can see the buildings on both shores simultaneously. If you have stood on that promontory at sunset, you have seen the light do something that it does nowhere else on earth. The water turns gold. The domes turn gold. The minarets cast shadows that lengthen across a landscape that has been continuously inhabited for longer than almost any other city on the planet. A landscape that contains layers of construction going down through centuries the way geological strata go down through epochs. Roman beneath Byzantine, beneath Ottoman, beneath modern. Each layer resting on the last. Each layer containing the remains of the people who lived and built and fought and died on this particular piece of earth. This is the complete story of that place, from the Greek fishermen who first settled the promontory to the Roman emperor who remade it, from the walls that held the world at bay to the morning they finally fell, from the golden age when this city was the most civilized place on earth to the long, slow twilight when the civilization contracted and the enemies gathered, and the end, when it came on a Tuesday. It is a story about walls, about what walls can protect and what they cannot, about the difference between surviving and living, between enduring and thriving, about what happens to a city that is too valuable to be left alone and too stubborn to surrender and too proud to accept that the world it was built to rule has become a world that no longer needs a ruler of that kind. It is, if you listen carefully, a story about every city, about what cities are for and what they cost and what survives when the thing that made them necessary has passed. Settle in. This is the complete story of Constantinople. It begins with water, not the water of rivers, though rivers matter, not the water of rain, though rain matters, the water of straits, the water that moves between 2 bodies of water that are themselves enormous, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, through a channel so narrow that from certain angles you can see both shores at once, and so deep and so turbulent that the currents within it have been studied by oceanographers and navigators for centuries. Without being fully mastered, the water is what made this place what it is. The water is what drew the first settlers and the first conquerors and the first emperors and every army that ever looked at this promontory and understood that whoever held it held the key to the movement of goods and people and power between the eastern half of the world and the western half, The water is the constant. Everything else, the empires, the religions, the names, the populations, all of it has changed. The water has not changed. The Bosphorus still flows where it has always flowed, and the Golden Horn still curves where it has always curved. And the strategic reality that made this place the most coveted city on Earth 26 centuries ago is the same strategic reality that makes it one of the most important cities on Earth tonight. Every great city begins with geography. Before the politics, before the monuments, before the first stone is laid on the first foundation, there is the land itself, the shape of the coastline, the depth of the harbour, the availability of fresh water, the defensibility of the position, the relationship between this particular point on the Earth's surface and the trade routes and the agricultural hinterland and the strategic corridors that determine whether a settlement will flourish or fail. A city is, before it is anything else, an argument about location. And the argument that Constantinople made was the strongest argument any city has ever made. The promontory sits at the southwestern end of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait that connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and, through the Dardanelles beyond, to the Aegean and the Mediterranean. The strait is about 20 miles long and, at its narrowest, less than a mile wide. On the European side, the promontory juts out into the water like a finger pointing east, creating on its northern edge a deep natural harbour that curves inland for about 4 miles. A harbour so well sheltered and so deep that it became known, eventually, as the Golden Horn, a name that described both its shape and its commercial value. The triangle of land formed by the Golden Horn to the north, the Bosphorus to the east, and the Sea of Marmara to the south, is approximately 7 miles in circumference. It is hilly. The highest point is about 150 feet above sea level. The hills slope down to the water on 3 sides, creating natural defensive positions that an army approaching from any direction would have to climb. An army approaching from the sea would face the currents of the strait, which are treacherous and strong, and change direction depending on the depth at which they flow. An army approaching from the north would have to cross the Golden Horn, which could be chained shut across its mouth to prevent the passage of ships. An army approaching from the west, the only direction from which the promontory connects to the mainland, would face whatever fortifications the city chose to build across the approximately 4 miles of land that the triangle's base traversed. The site was, in military terms, as close to impregnable as geography could make a place without surrounding it entirely with water. And the fact that it was not entirely surrounded by water, that it remained connected to the mainland and therefore to the overland trade routes of Europe and Asia simultaneously, was not a weakness but a final perfection. It was a fortress that was also a crossroads, a defensive position that was also a commercial hub, a place that could be held against enemies and open to merchants, shut when threatened and open when safe. A switch at the junction of 3 continents that whoever controlled it could set to whatever position served their interests. The Greeks found it around 657 BC. The precise circumstances of the founding are wrapped in the particular mixture of history and legend that characterizes the origins of most ancient cities, a mixture in which the facts are real, but the stories that carry them are decorated with the gods and the oracles and the omens that the culture of the time considered essential to any narrative of significant events. The founding, by tradition, is attributed to a man named Byzas from the Greek city of Megara, who led a group of colonists across the Aegean in search of a place to establish a new settlement. Byzas, according to the story, consulted the oracle at Delphi before setting out. The oracle told him to settle opposite the blind. He sailed through the Aegean, through the Dardanelles, into the Sea of Marmara, up the Bosphorus, and when he reached the strait and saw the promontory on the European side, and then looked across the water at the existing settlement of Chalcedon on the Asian side, he understood what the oracle meant. The people of Chalcedon had built their city on the inferior site. They were the blind. They had been looking at the promontory for years and had not understood what they were seeing. Byzas built his city on the promontory and named it after himself, Byzantium. For the next 8 centuries, Byzantium was a city of moderate importance. Not obscure, not negligible. The location ensured that it would always matter to someone. It sat on the trade route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, the route by which grain from the fertile lands around the Black Sea coast reached the markets of the Mediterranean world. Ships passing through the Bosphorus paid tolls, merchants stopped and traded. The harbour was busy, the city grew. It was fought over. The Persians held it for a time. The Athenians competed for influence over it. Alexander the Great's empire absorbed it. The Romans eventually took control of it. As the Romans eventually took control of everything in the Mediterranean basin, with the methodical efficiency of a system that understood the value of every port and every strait and every choke point in the trading network that sustained it. Under Roman rule, Byzantium was a provincial city, important for its location, not important for itself, a node in the Roman network, useful and unremarkable, the kind of city that functioned effectively within the system without drawing particular attention to itself. This was about to change so completely that the city's previous 8 centuries of existence would become, in retrospect, merely a prologue, a long, patient, unremarkable wait for the person who would finally see in it what the oracle had always seen in it. A man who would remake the world was looking at the map, and the map was telling him something that none of his predecessors had been willing to hear. Rome was no longer the center. The center was here. But before Constantine, before the empire found this place, the promontory had already been teaching its lesson for nearly 1,000 years. The lesson was about water, about what water gives and what water protects, about the difference between a city that sits beside the sea and a city that is embraced by it. The Golden Horn was the key, not the Bosphorus, magnificent as the strait was, not the Sea of Marmara stretching south toward the Aegean, the Golden Horn. This deep, natural inlet, curving inland for 4 miles along the northern edge of the promontory, created a harbour so perfect that ships could anchor in it during the worst storms the Black Sea could produce, and ride out the weather in water as calm as a lake. The depth was consistent, the currents were manageable. The shelter was complete. 1,000 ships could anchor in the Golden Horn simultaneously, and 1,000 ships did anchor there century after century, because the merchants of the Mediterranean world understood that this harbour was the safest and most profitable place to bring their goods. The fishermen knew, before the merchants, before the soldiers, before the empires. The fishermen knew the waters around the promontory were extraordinarily rich. The currents of the Bosphorus, where the cold, deep waters of the Black Sea met the warmer waters of the Mediterranean, created conditions that supported enormous populations of fish: tuna, bonito, mackerel, swordfish. The spring migrations brought them through the strait in numbers that astonished the ancient writers who described them. Rivers of fish moving through the channel, so dense that they could almost be scooped from the water by hand. The climate was hospitable, not gentle, not Mediterranean in the way that the Greek islands were Mediterranean, but temperate. Warm summers, cool winters, occasionally cold, but not the brutal cold of the northern steppes. Rain fell in sufficient quantities. The surrounding countryside, the hills of Thrace to the west and Bithynia to the east, produced grain and wine and olive oil in quantities adequate to support a significant population. Everything conspired: the geography, the harbour, the currents, the fish, the climate, the position at the junction of trade routes, the defensibility of the promontory itself. Everything pointed at this place and said, "Here, build here. Whatever you build here will last, because the reasons for building here are not temporary, are not dependent on the politics of the moment, are written into the permanent structure of the earth and the sea and the currents that flow between them." There is a particular kind of decision that changes history, not because it is surprising, but because it is obvious. So obvious that the question, once it is finally asked, is not why someone made this decision, but why no one made it sooner. In the year 324 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine stood at the edge of the promontory that Byzas had settled nearly 1,000 years before, And he saw what Byzas had seen, what the oracle had described, what every sailor and merchant who had passed through the Bosphorus for centuries had seen without fully understanding. He saw the most strategically perfect city site on the surface of the earth. Constantine was not a man given to sentiment about geography. He was a soldier, a politician, a survivor of the brutal succession wars that had torn the Roman Empire apart for the previous 2 decades. He had fought his way to sole control of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, and he had done so with a ruthlessness that his contemporaries found unremarkable only because ruthlessness was the baseline requirement for anyone who sought to hold the Roman world together. He was also a man who had recently made another decision that would reverberate through history for 2,000 years. He had legalized Christianity. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD had ended the persecution of Christians throughout the empire, and Constantine himself had converted, or was in the process of converting, or had the political wisdom to associate himself closely with the fastest growing religion in his domain. Depending on which historical interpretation you find most persuasive, the distinction matters less than the result. Christianity was rising. The emperor was attached to it, and the center of Christianity's growth was not in the Latin West, it was in the Greek East. The empire's strategic challenges were in the East. The Persian Sassanid Empire, Rome's great rival, pressed against the eastern frontier, the Danube frontier, where the Gothic and other Germanic peoples were becoming increasingly difficult to manage, was closer to the Bosphorus than to the Tiber. The wealth of the empire, the productive agricultural lands, and the busy trade routes was overwhelmingly concentrated in the eastern provinces: Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, the Balkans. The grain, the gold, the commercial energy that kept the empire functioning flowed through the east. Rome was in the wrong place. This was the obvious thing that no one had said, or rather that several people had said in various ways, and that the institutional inertia of an empire built around a specific city had prevented anyone from acting upon. Rome was the capital because Rome had always been the capital. Rome was the center because Rome had been the center when the empire was smaller and western-focused, and the threats came from Gaul and Carthage rather than from Persia and the Danube. The world had changed. Rome had not moved, and the distance between where the capital was and where the capital needed to be had grown over centuries into a structural inefficiency that was weakening the empire's ability to respond to the threats that actually mattered. Constantine looked at the promontory and made his decision. He would build a new capital here, on this triangle of land between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. He would build it from the ground up, designed from the beginning to be what it needed to be, a capital worthy of the empire, a city that reflected both the power of Rome and the new religious identity that Constantine was weaving into the fabric of Roman governance. The construction began in 324 and was completed in its initial phase with extraordinary speed. Constantine mobilized the resources of an empire: architects, engineers, laborers, artists. The best that the Roman world could produce were directed to the Bosphorus and set to work. Stone was quarried, harbors were expanded, aqueducts were designed to bring fresh water from the hills to the north. A hippodrome was built, modeled on the Circus Maximus in Rome, the great arena where chariot races would become the defining public entertainment of the city for centuries. Churches were constructed, including the first version of what would eventually become the most important church in Christendom. He brought the trappings of Rome, literally. Statues, columns, and monuments were taken from cities across the empire and transported to the new capital, not as plunder, but as a deliberate statement that the cultural inheritance of the Roman world was being relocated to its new center. The Serpent Column from Delphi, a bronze monument commemorating the Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea in 479 BC, was brought to the Hippodrome. Obelisks from Egypt, sculptures from Greece. The new city was dressed in the accumulated visual wealth of the civilizations that had preceded it. A city that wore history the way a general wears decorations, as evidence of what had been conquered and absorbed and claimed. On May 11th, 330 AD, Constantine dedicated the city, Nova Roma, he called it. New Rome, the name that was supposed to stick, the name that carried the message he intended, that this was not a replacement for Rome, but a continuation of it, that the empire was not being divided or diminished, but relocated, recentered, repositioned for the next phase of its existence. The name did not stick. Almost immediately, people called it Constantinople, Constantine's city. The name honored the man rather than the concept, which tells you something about how the world works, that the personal attaches more firmly to a place than the institutional, that a city named for a person is more memorable than a city named for an idea. The city grew with a speed that astonished the ancient world. People came from across the empire, from the eastern provinces especially, drawn by opportunity and by the gravitational pull that a new capital exerts on an empire's population. Merchants came because the trade routes now had a new and voracious hub. Administrators came because the government was here. Clergy came because the emperor, who had legalized their faith, was building churches with imperial funds. Artisans came because a new city needed everything built and decorated and maintained. The population grew from roughly 30,000 at the time of the dedication to perhaps 300,000 by the end of the century. The city organized itself around the structures Constantine had given it. The Mise, the central avenue, ran from the Golden Gate in the western walls to the Augustation, the great square beside the Hagia Sophia, a broad colonnaded road that was the spine of the city, the route along which triumphal processions moved and merchants displayed their most valuable goods, and the daily life of an imperial capital flowed with the particular density of a city that knew it was the center of the world. Along the Mise, forums opened at intervals, public squares decorated with the statues and columns that Constantine had brought from across the empire. The Forum of Constantine, with its great column of porphyry, the purple stone that only emperors were permitted to use, topped with a statue of the emperor himself in the guise of Apollo, the sun god, a blending of pagan and Christian symbolism that characterized the early years of the Christian Empire, when the boundaries between the old religion and the new were still being negotiated, and the visual language of power still borrowed freely from both. The Hippodrome was the social heart of the city, capable of holding 100,000 spectators. It was the place where the emperor showed himself to his people, where the chariot races that Constantinople loved with a passion that bordered on mania were run, where the political factions that organized themselves around the racing teams, the blues and the greens, expressed their loyalties and their grievances with a directness that occasionally tipped into violence. The Hippodrome was the place where the relationship between ruler and ruled was performed, where the emperor sat in the imperial box and the crowd below him cheered or jeered, and the distance between them, the physical distance of the architecture and the political distance of the hierarchy, was simultaneously maintained and bridged by the shared spectacle of the race. The religious infrastructure grew rapidly. Churches multiplied, monasteries were founded, the institutional architecture of Christianity, the bishops and the councils and the theological schools that would shape the religion for the next millennium took root in Constantinople with the enthusiasm of a faith that had spent 3 centuries being persecuted and now found itself not merely tolerated, but actively promoted by the most powerful government on earth. The city attracted talent, scholars, rhetoricians, philosophers, artists, engineers. The ambitious and the gifted from across the eastern Mediterranean came to the new capital because the new capital was where the opportunity was, where the money was, where the attention of power was focused. The population was cosmopolitan in a way that few cities of the ancient world had achieved. Greek-speaking primarily, but with significant communities of Latins, Syrians, Armenians, Egyptians, Jews, a diversity that gave the city its particular character, its particular energy, its sense of being a place where the entire Eastern world had been compressed into a single urban space. This was the city that Constantine died knowing he had created. He died in 337 AD, on the 22nd of May, baptized on his deathbed in the tradition of the era, which preferred to delay baptism until the last possible moment to ensure that the sins of a lifetime were washed away with maximum efficiency. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the church he had built for this purpose, surrounded by the cenotaphs of the 12 apostles, placed among them as the 13th, the equal of the apostles, the man who had given Christianity its empire and the empire its new Christian capital. The city he left behind was incomplete. It was always going to be incomplete. A city of this ambition, built in 6 years, could not have been finished, but the foundation was laid, the direction was set, and the momentum was established. And the centuries that followed would build on what he had started with, a sustained creative energy that would make Constantinople the most extraordinary city of the medieval world. Constantine built walls. The first set of walls enclosed the original promontory and the area immediately to its west, protecting the city from land attack across the base of the triangle. These walls were adequate for the city of 330. They would not be adequate for long. The city was already outgrowing them before Constantine died in 337, expanding westward beyond the fortifications, spilling out into the suburbs that were forming along the road to Thrace. The problem of the walls would be solved with a thoroughness that would define the city for the next millennium by an emperor who came after Constantine by about 80 years. But that solution, and the extraordinary civilization that grew behind it, belongs to the next chapter of this story. What Constantine had done was enough. He had taken a provincial city on a perfect site and turned it into the capital of the world's most powerful empire. He had done it in 6 years. He had created, from the bare promontory and the existing bones of Byzantium, a city that would outlast the empire it was built to serve, that would watch the western half of that empire collapse into fragments, while it continued behind its walls for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Think about that number for a moment. 1,000 years of continuous existence as a major imperial capital. 1,000 years during which the city endured sieges and plagues and earthquakes and fires and palace coups and civil wars and the relentless pressure of every neighboring power that looked at its location and its wealth and wanted both. No other city in history has maintained that status for that duration under that kind of pressure. None. The story of how it did this, of what sustained it, of what the people who lived behind those walls built and preserved and transmitted to the future, is one of the great stories of human civilization. And it begins with the walls themselves. There is something about a wall that goes beyond its physical function. A wall is a statement. It says, "This side is ours." It says, "What is inside is worth protecting." It says, "We believe in the future of what we have built strongly enough to invest the enormous effort required to surround it with stone." A wall is optimism expressed in masonry. It is the physical manifestation of a community's conviction that it has something worth keeping. The walls of Constantinople were the greatest walls ever built. Not the longest, not the tallest, the greatest. The most effective defensive fortification in the history of military architecture, measured by the simplest and most relevant criterion available: how long they held and what they held against. They held for 1,000 years. They held against every army that the medieval world could produce. They held when the rest of the Roman world was falling to pieces around them, when the western provinces were being carved into kingdoms by Germanic tribes, and the political structure of the ancient world was dissolving into the feudal mosaic of the early Middle Ages. Constantinople held because its walls held. The civilization inside survived because the stone outside survived. The relationship between the two, between the culture and the fortification, between what was preserved and what did the preserving, is the central fact of Byzantine history. The walls that accomplished this were built in the early 5th century during the reign of Theodosius II by a prefect named Anthemius. The emperor was a child when the walls were commissioned. The decision was made by the adults who governed in his name, adults who understood that the city's growth had made Constantine's original walls inadequate and that the threats gathering on the empire's borders required a new level of fortification. What Anthemius built was not a wall, It was a system, a defense in depth, a series of obstacles arranged in sequence so that an attacker who overcame one faced another, and then another, each more formidable than the last, the cumulative effect being not just physical resistance, but psychological demoralization, the grinding down of an enemy's will as each barrier gave way to the sight of the next. The system began with a moat, 60 feet wide, 20 feet deep, filled with water that was fed and controlled through a network of pipes and sluices. An army arriving from the west would encounter this first, a broad trench of water stretching the full 4 miles of the land wall from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, too wide to bridge quickly and too deep to wade. Behind the moat was an open terrace, about 30 feet wide. This was a killing ground. Any attacker who crossed the moat would emerge into an open space overlooked by the defenders on the wall behind, exposed and exhausted, and under fire from above. Behind the terrace rose the outer wall, 25 feet high, with towers spaced at regular intervals, each tower projecting outward from the wall line to create overlapping fields of fire. The outer wall was a serious fortification in itself, capable of resisting a siege without any additional support. Most medieval cities had nothing more than this. Constantinople had this, and then something else entirely. Behind the outer wall was another terrace, another killing ground, another open space in which attackers who had somehow breached the outer wall would find themselves exposed and overlooked. And behind that terrace rose the inner wall. The inner wall was 40 feet high, 15 feet thick at the base, faced with fitted limestone blocks so precisely joined that a blade could not be inserted between them. The towers were 60 feet tall, spaced roughly 60 yards apart along the full length of the wall, each one a self-contained fortress, capable of independent defense even if the wall sections on either side were breached. The towers were octagonal or square, depending on the section, and each contained multiple levels from which archers and other defenders could fire down at attackers at various ranges and angles. The full system, from the outer edge of the moat to the inner face of the Great Wall, was about 200 feet deep. An attacker approaching from the west faced 200 feet of engineered killing, a gauntlet of water and stone and fire that had to be traversed under continuous bombardment from defenders who were positioned above and who had practiced the defense of these specific positions for their entire professional lives. The sea walls were different but equally formidable. Along the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, the walls were somewhat lower but were supplemented by the natural defense of the water itself and by the massive chain that could be drawn across the mouth of the Golden Horn to prevent enemy ships from entering the harbour. The chain was enormous, its links forged of iron, supported by floating booms capable of stopping any vessel of the era. Behind these walls, the city that Constantine had founded grew into something extraordinary. At its peak, in the 5th and 6th centuries, Constantinople was the largest city in the world. Its population may have reached 500,000 people. The streets were paved. The aqueducts brought water from springs 60 miles to the north, feeding a network of cisterns, some of them underground and so vast that they are used today as tourist attractions and event spaces. Cathedral-like caverns of brick and stone, filled with pillars that hold up the vaulted ceilings in darkness that has persisted since the 6th century. The city had hospitals, it had libraries, it had universities, it had a postal system, and a system of public welfare, and a legal code that would become the foundation of European law for 1,000 years. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law compiled under Justinian in the 530s, organized and codified Roman legal precedent into a system so comprehensive and so well structured that it was adopted as the basis of legal systems across Europe when the Renaissance rediscovered it. A legal framework created in Constantinople in the 6th century that still shapes how law is practiced in the 21st. The art was extraordinary. The mosaics that decorated the churches and palaces of Constantinople were composed of millions of tiny glass and stone tesserae, set at precisely calculated angles to catch and reflect light. creating images that seemed to glow from within, images of saints and emperors and the Virgin Mary rendered in gold and lapis blue and deep red. Images that visitors from the less sophisticated courts of Western Europe described in terms that could not contain their astonishment. When ambassadors from the Rus, the Viking-descended people of Kiev, visited Constantinople in the 10th century and attended the liturgy at the Hagia Sophia, they reported back to their prince that they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth. They had never seen such beauty, they had never experienced anything that compared, they had never seen anything like it, because there was nothing like it to see. And above all of it, crowning the highest of the city's 7 hills, dominating the skyline in a way that made it visible from miles away on the water, rose the building that was the physical expression of everything Constantinople believed about itself, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Justinian wanted the impossible. This is the simplest way to describe what he asked for when he commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia in 532 AD, because what he described to his architects was a building that the engineering knowledge of the 6th century said could not be built. A dome of unprecedented size, supported not by thick walls, but by a structural system so delicate and so counterintuitive that the 2 men he hired to design it were not, in the conventional sense, architects at all. They were mathematicians, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. Justinian chose them not because they knew how buildings worked, but because they understood how forces worked, how weight and thrust and compression and tension interacted in ways that could in principle hold a vast dome in the air if the geometry was exactly right. The geometry had to be exactly right. There was no margin. The dome Justinian wanted was 107 feet in diameter and would sit 180 feet above the floor, supported not by the continuous circular wall that conventional dome construction required, but by 4 enormous piers that transferred the dome's weight downward through a system of arches and pendentives, the curving triangular sections that bridged the gap between the square base and the circular dome. A structural solution that had been used before on a small scale, but never at this scale. Never at a scale where the forces involved were so enormous that a miscalculation of a few inches in the geometry of a pendentive could bring the entire structure down. 10,000 workers labored for 5 years. The materials came from across the empire, marble from quarries in Greece and Turkey and Egypt, each color chosen for the specific position it would occupy in the interior. White and green and purple and pink, arranged in patterns that moved the eye upward from the floor, through the columns and the galleries, to the base of the dome and then up the curve of the dome itself, to the crown. 180 feet above, where a ring of 40 windows admitted the light that was the building's most extraordinary feature. The windows were set so close together that from the interior, looking up, the base of the dome appeared to be resting on a continuous ring of light rather than on solid stone. The dome seemed to float. This was the effect Justinian wanted, and this was the effect that Anthemius and Isidore achieved through a combination of mathematical precision and what can only be described as architectural genius. The genius of understanding not just how a building stands, but how a building feels. The interior was covered in gold mosaic. The dome, the semi-domes, the arches, the upper walls, all of them sheathed in millions of glass tesserae backed with gold leaf, so that the light entering through the ring of windows struck the mosaics and was reflected and re-reflected across the vast interior space, filling the building with a luminosity that had no apparent source, a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that made the air itself seem to glow. Justinian entered the completed building on December 27 AD, and according to the account that has come down through the centuries, he stood in the center of the nave and looked up at the dome floating on its ring of light and said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." He was comparing his church to the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, the greatest sacred building of the ancient world. He was saying that what he had built was greater. He was probably right. The Hagia Sophia was the largest enclosed space in the world. It would remain so for nearly 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, no one built anything bigger. The building became the spiritual center of Orthodox Christianity. Emperors were crowned in it, councils were held in it, the liturgy performed beneath its dome, with the candlelight reflecting off the gold mosaics and the incense rising into the vast space, and the chanting of the priests filling the air with a sound that the acoustics of the building amplified and sustained in ways that modern acoustic engineers have studied and found difficult to replicate. That liturgy was the most powerful religious experience available in the medieval world. Visitors wept. This is documented. People entered the building and wept, not from sorrow, but from the sheer overwhelming force of the beauty, the scale, the quality of the light, the sense of being inside something that was too large and too perfect to have been made by human hands. The building survived earthquakes. The dome partially collapsed in 558, just 20 years after its completion, when a series of tremors weakened the pendentives that held it aloft. Isidore the Younger, the nephew of one of the original architects, rebuilt it, raising the dome higher and steepening its curve to distribute the forces more effectively. The rebuilt dome was more stable than the original. It has stood since 563 through 14 centuries of earthquakes and weather and war. The Hagia Sophia was not merely a building, it was an argument about what civilization was for. The people who built it believed that the purpose of collective human effort was not merely to survive, but to create something that justified survival. Something that demonstrated that the species was capable of more than eating and fighting and reproducing. Something that pointed upward, literally and figuratively, toward a quality of experience that the daily business of being human did not ordinarily provide. The argument was made in light. This cannot be emphasized enough. The medium of the Hagia Sophia was light, not stone, though the stone was extraordinary, not gold, though the gold was lavish. Light. The windows, the mosaics, the angles of the surfaces, the height of the dome, everything was calculated to manipulate light, to channel it and reflect it and multiply it until the interior of the building was filled with a luminosity that seemed to have no natural source. Procopius, the historian who served as Justinian's official chronicler, wrote that the dome seemed not to rest upon solid masonry, but to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. He described the light as appearing to be generated within the building itself. He described the experience of standing in the nave as one that transformed the visitor, that made the person who entered different from the person who had stood outside, that accomplished through architecture what the liturgy accomplished through prayer, a lifting of the spirit into a space where the ordinary categories of experience no longer applied. 9 centuries of Orthodox worship took place beneath that dome, 9 centuries of Easter liturgies and imperial coronations, and the daily offices of prayer that structured the religious life of the city. 9 centuries during which the building was the fixed point around which the spiritual life of an entire civilization orbited, the place where God was most present, the place where the distance between the human and the divine was smallest, the place where the light did its work. In the 7th century, the world changed. It changed with a speed and a thoroughness that the people living through it could barely comprehend. In the space of roughly 100 years, from the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 to the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750, the entire southern and eastern rim of the Mediterranean was transformed. Egypt fell, Syria fell, Persia fell entirely and permanently. The great Sassanid Empire that had been Rome's rival for centuries swept away in a single generation. North Africa fell, Spain fell. The armies of the new faith advanced with a speed and a conviction that the existing powers could not match. Constantinople stood in the path. The first Arab siege came in 674. A fleet arrived from the south, carrying an army that had already conquered everything between Arabia and the Bosphorus. They were met with something they had not encountered before: Greek fire, the Byzantine secret weapon, a substance whose exact composition has never been determined with certainty because the Byzantines guarded the recipe with a secrecy that makes modern classified information look casually handled. It was a liquid that burned on water. It could be projected from siphons mounted on the prows of ships, producing jets of flame that engulfed enemy vessels and could not be extinguished by conventional means. Water did not put it out. Water may have made it worse. The exact composition of Greek fire is one of the great technological secrets of history. The Byzantines classified it with a thoroughness that suggests they understood at every level of their government and military that this substance was the single most important tactical advantage they possessed. The formula was known only to the imperial family and to the specific craftsmen who produced it. The penalty for revealing the secret was death. The production facilities were controlled directly by the emperor. No foreign power ever obtained the recipe, and when the Byzantine Empire finally fell, the secret was lost, genuinely lost, in a way that almost no other technological secret in history has been lost, because the people who knew it died without transmitting it. Modern chemists have speculated about the composition: naphtha, pine resin, sulfur, quicklime. Various combinations of these and other substances have been proposed. Experiments have been conducted. Some have produced results that approximate the descriptions of Greek fire in the ancient sources: the clinging, the burning on water, the difficulty of extinguishment. But none has perfectly replicated what the sources describe, and the exact formula remains unknown. A secret that the Byzantines kept for over 700 years, and that they took to the grave when the empire that had kept it could no longer sustain itself. The psychological impact of Greek fire was as significant as its physical effects. An army or a navy that had never encountered it before did not know what it was seeing. Fire that burned on water violated the basic categories of experience. Fire was supposed to be extinguished by water. That was how the world worked. When the world stopped working that way, when the sea itself seemed to be burning and the ships that were supposed to float on water were instead consumed by fire that came from the water, the effect on morale was devastating. Men who would have fought bravely against arrows and swords and battering rams broke and fled from Greek fire, because Greek fire was something outside the frame of what courage had prepared them to face. The Arab fleet burned. The siege lasted 4 years, from 674 to 678. It failed. The walls held on land, the Greek fire held on water. They came back. In 717, a second and larger Arab force attempted the siege. 2,000 ships, over 100,000 soldiers, the largest military force that had been assembled against the city in its history to that point. Had Constantinople fallen in 718, the Arab armies would have had a clear path into the Balkans, into Central Europe, into a Western world that was fragmented and militarily weak. Constantinople held. The Greek fire burned the fleet again. The walls resisted the assault again. A brutal winter killed thousands of the besieging soldiers, men from the warm climates of Arabia and Syria, who were not equipped for the cold. Disease spread through the camps. Supply lines failed. The siege broke in the summer of 718. The city had saved Europe. The military reality of the 8th century was that Constantinople's walls were the shield behind which the rest of the Christian world sheltered, while it was too weak to defend itself. The walls held. And because the walls held, there was time for the Western kingdoms to consolidate and develop the structures that would eventually allow them to defend themselves. The Bulgars came. The Rus came. Various combinations of enemies came over the following centuries. The walls held. The walls always held. The city developed a reputation for invincibility that was, in military terms, entirely justified, but the city was not merely a fortress. This is the thing that the narrative of sieges and survival can obscure if it is told too simply. The city was a civilization. What happened behind the walls in the centuries between the sieges was as extraordinary as the fact that the walls held. The Byzantine court was the most sophisticated in the medieval world. The ceremonies were elaborate beyond anything that the Western kingdoms could produce. Rituals of such complexity and such beauty that they served a political function as well as a ceremonial one, demonstrating to visiting ambassadors and foreign rulers that the power they were dealing with was of a kind that their own kingdoms could not match. The emperor received visitors on a golden throne that could be mechanically elevated to different heights during an audience, so that a visitor who had bowed to an emperor at one level would raise his eyes to find the emperor now above him. A piece of theatrical engineering that combined engineering skill with political psychology in a way that only Constantinople could have produced. Mechanical lions roared, mechanical birds sang in mechanical trees. The throne room was a chamber of wonders designed to overwhelm the senses of visitors from less technologically advanced cultures, and it worked consistently for centuries. The reports that ambassadors sent home after visiting Constantinople are full of descriptions that read like encounters with magic, because the gap between Byzantine engineering and what the rest of the medieval world could produce was large enough that the difference felt qualitative rather than merely quantitative. The intellectual life was equally extraordinary. The university that Constantine had established continued to function, training the civil servants and the scholars and the theologians who ran the most complex government in the medieval world. The libraries held collections that included the works of classical Greek authors, works that had been lost everywhere else, works that survived only because Byzantine scribes continued to copy them, century after century, maintaining a chain of transmission that connected the ancient world to the modern one through a continuous line of ink on parchment. The art evolved continuously across the centuries, developing the icon tradition that remains the most distinctive visual contribution of Orthodox Christianity. The icons were not merely pictures, they were theological objects, windows into the divine, points of contact between the visible world and the invisible one. The painters who produced them worked within strict conventions that governed the composition and the colors and the proportions of the figures. Conventions that were not considered limitations but liberations, frameworks within which the spiritual content could be expressed without the distraction of individual artistic ego. The gold backgrounds were not decorative, they represented the light of the divine, the uncreated light that Orthodox theology distinguished from the created light of the sun, the light that emanated from God rather than from any physical source. The city produced saints and scholars and emperors and generals and merchants and artists across 1,000 years of continuous operation. And the sum of what they produced, the total contribution of Byzantine civilization to the human project, is still not fully appreciated by a Western historical tradition that has tended to treat Byzantium as a footnote to Rome rather than as a civilization of equal significance and considerably greater duration. But the walls were always there. The walls were the condition that made everything else possible. The art and the scholarship and the theology and the commerce and the imperial ceremony, all of it happened inside the walls. All of it would have been impossible without the walls. This is the relationship that defined Constantinople for 1,000 years. The interior life depended on the exterior defense. The civilization depended on the fortification. The beautiful depended on the strong. The invincible city, the city that could not fall. And then, in 1204, it fell, not to the enemies who had been trying to take it for centuries. It fell to its allies. It fell to Christians. It fell to an army of crusaders who had set out from Europe to fight for the Holy Land and who ended up sacking the richest Christian city in the world instead. The Fourth Crusade. The wound that never healed. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to go to Egypt. That was the plan. A crusader army, assembled from the nobility of France and Flanders, would sail to Egypt and use it as a base from which to recapture Jerusalem. The army assembled in Venice. In 1202, Venice had contracted to provide the ships at a price. The price was 85,000 silver marks. The Crusaders arrived and discovered that they could not pay. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, was over 80 years old and nearly blind and had not survived to that age by failing to recognize an opportunity when one presented itself. He proposed that the Crusaders work off part of their debt by helping Venice recapture the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast. The fact that Zara was a Christian city was an inconvenience that the urgency of the financial situation overcame. They took Zara. The Pope excommunicated the entire expedition. The Crusaders continued anyway, with the particular momentum that large military enterprises develop. Once they are in motion, then a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, approached the crusade with a proposal. Help him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, and in return, he would fund the crusade's continuation to Egypt, place the Byzantine Church under Roman authority, and contribute 10,000 soldiers. The offer was too good. It was exactly the kind of offer that is too good because it cannot be honored. The crusade diverted to Constantinople. They arrived in June 1203. The Crusaders looked at the walls and the domes and the sheer scale of the place and experienced something close to collective vertigo. These were men from cities that might have had 50,000 people. Constantinople had 500,000. They attacked it anyway. The first assault placed Alexios on the throne. The promised payments did not come. They could not come. The Byzantine treasury did not contain what Alexios had promised. Relations deteriorated. Alexios was deposed in a palace coup and killed. The Crusaders decided to take the city for themselves. The assault came on April 12th and 13th, 1204. The attack came from the Golden Horn, where the walls were lower. The Venetian ships were modified with fighting platforms on the masts. The attack was violent and sustained, and eventually successful. What followed was 3 days of sack. 3 days during which the accumulated wealth of 9 centuries of imperial civilization was looted and destroyed and carried away. Churches were stripped. Icons were smashed. Manuscripts were destroyed. The bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome since the time of Constantine were taken down and shipped to Venice, where they would stand on St. Mark's Basilica for the next 800 years. The libraries burned, the private collections, the monastic archives, the accumulated texts that had been preserved and copied and maintained through the centuries in which Constantinople was the custodian of the classical world's literary heritage. Vast quantities of this material was destroyed in the sack, lost permanently, the words of ancient authors consigned to the fire by men who could not read them. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople. It lasted 57 years and was by any reasonable assessment a failure. The Latin rulers did not have the capacity to manage a city of this complexity. Constantinople deteriorated under their control. The population declined. The buildings fell into disrepair. The cultural damage was incalculable and permanent. The sack of 1204 destroyed or dispersed one of the greatest concentrations of art, literature, and sacred objects that the medieval world had produced. Relics that had been venerated for centuries were stolen and distributed to churches across Western Europe, where they remain today. The fragmentary souvenirs of a civilization that was dismembered by the people who claimed to share its faith. The intellectual loss was worse. The libraries of Constantinople had contained texts that existed nowhere else. Manuscripts that were the last surviving copies of works by ancient authors, the single threads by which certain pieces of ancient knowledge were connected to the future. When those threads were cut, when the manuscripts burned in the fires that the Crusaders set, or were simply discarded by men who could not read Greek and had no interest in what the scrolls contained, the knowledge was gone, not relocated, not redistributed, gone, lost permanently from the total of what the human race knew about itself and its past. The Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, who witnessed a sack and survived it, wrote an account that is one of the most devastating descriptions of cultural destruction in the literature of any civilization. He described soldiers smashing icons and using the sacred vessels of the Hagia Sophia as drinking cups. He described prostitutes sitting on the patriarchal throne. He described the systematic, comprehensive, 3-day destruction of a civilization by the people who had been welcomed as its defenders. And his account has the quality of a man who is writing not just for his contemporaries, but for the future, who understands that what he is witnessing is so significant that the record must survive even if the civilization does not. The Byzantines retook the city in 1261 Michael VIII Palaiologos led a small army through an unguarded gate and reclaimed the capital. But the city that was restored was not the city that had been lost. The sack of 1204 had done something that the Arab sieges and the Bulgar raids had never done. It had broken the spell. The invincible city had been taken. The wealth had been carried away. The population had declined from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands. The empire had been fragmented into competing successor states, and the restoration of 1261 could not restore it to what it had been. The last 2 centuries of Constantinople's existence as a Byzantine city were centuries of slow contraction. The empire shrank, the population shrank, the great buildings were maintained as well as reduced resources allowed, which was not well enough, and the city began to appear as a place living on its past, a city of ghosts and memories occupying spaces too large for the population that remained. The physical evidence of the decline was visible to anyone who visited. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, their buildings falling into ruin, their streets reverting to unpaved tracks between the remains of what had been homes and workshops and churches. Fields were cultivated within the city walls, open agricultural land where dense urban fabric had existed a century before. The population that remained clustered around the major churches and the markets and the harbour, leaving the periphery of the walled area to the process of slow natural reclamation that happens when human maintenance ceases and the weather and the vegetation take over. The emperors of the final dynasty, the Palaiologoi, who ruled from 1261 to 1453, were men of intelligence and sometimes of genuine ability who were confronted with a problem that intelligence and ability could not solve. The empire they governed was too small, too poor, and too surrounded to sustain the city that was supposed to be its capital. The revenue was not there, the military was not there, the population was not there. They governed a memory rather than an empire, the institutional shell of what had been the most powerful state in the medieval world, now reduced to the city itself and a few fragments of territory in Greece and the Aegean. They sought alliances, they negotiated with the Western powers, with the papacy, with Venice and Genoa, offering the one thing they had that the West wanted, which was the submission of the Orthodox Church to Roman authority, in exchange for the military help they needed to survive. The negotiations went on for decades. The offers were made and withdrawn and revised and re-offered with the desperate persistence of people who understood that the alternative to negotiation was extinction. The West debated. The West sent envoys and received envoys and convened councils and discussed the theological implications of reunion and produced documents and made promises and in the end did not send the armies that would have been necessary to change the outcome. And to the east, a new power was rising, a power that looked at Constantinople with the same hunger that every power for the last 1,000 years had brought to it, but with something additional: patience. And cannons. The Ottomans were coming. Mehmed entered the city on the afternoon of the 29th. He rode through the streets on horseback, through the aftermath of the morning's violence. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted. He entered the building. He walked into the nave and looked up at the dome that had been floating on its ring of light for 916 years, and he understood what he was standing inside. He was 21 years old, and he had just accomplished what no one in history had accomplished, and the building that received him was equal to the achievement. He ordered the building converted to a mosque. The mosaics were not immediately destroyed. Some were covered with plaster. Minarets were added to the exterior. A mihrab was installed, indicating the direction of Mecca. The building that had been the greatest church in Christendom became the greatest mosque in Islam. Mehmed did something else that deserves to be noted. He repopulated the city. Constantinople had been declining for 2 centuries. The population at the time of the siege may have been as low as 40 or 50,000. Mehmed wanted it to be a great city again. He brought people in: Muslims from Anatolia, Christians from the conquered Balkans, Jews who found in Ottoman Constantinople a tolerance that many of the Christian kingdoms of Europe did not offer. He rebuilt. He constructed new mosques, new markets, new public buildings. He restored the aqueducts. The city he built became, over the following centuries, one of the great cities of the world again. Ottoman Constantinople, Ottoman Istanbul, the name that gradually replaced the old one, became the capital of an empire that would endure for over 400 years and that would at its height control territory from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. The Hagia Sophia stood at the center of it, the dome that Justinian had built and that the Ottoman architects studied and learned from, became the model for the great mosques that followed, the Süleymaniye and the Sultan Ahmed, and the dozens of other mosques that fill the Istanbul skyline today, all of them descendants of the Hagia Sophia, all of them conversations across centuries and across faiths about what it means to build a space that makes the divine feel present. The walls remained. They stand today, damaged and patched, and partly ruined but still recognizable, still tracing the line drawn in the 5th century. You can walk along them. You can touch the stone that the Arab armies could not breach, and that the Crusaders breached through treachery, and that the Ottoman cannons finally broke. The stone is there, 1,500 years of it, still standing in the Istanbul sunlight. Istanbul today is a city of 16 million people. It is the largest city in Europe. It sprawls across both sides of the Bosphorus, European and Asian, the bridge between continents that it has always been, the meeting point that geography made and that no amount of political change has been able to unmake. The modern city has grown far beyond the walls. The old city, the triangle of the original promontory, is now just the historical center surrounded by a metropolis that extends for miles in every direction across both continents. A city that generates 10% of Turkey's GDP and contains more history per square mile than almost any other inhabited place on Earth. The bazaars are still there. The Grand Bazaar, built in the decades after the Ottoman conquest, covers 61 streets and contains over 4,000 shops, a covered city within a city, a commercial ecosystem that has been operating continuously for over 500 years. The air inside smells of spice and leather and the particular dusty sweetness of old stone buildings that have been used for commerce for so long that the commerce has become part of the stone. The muezzin's call still sounds 5 times a day from the minarets of the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, the Blue Mosque, built in the 17th century across the square from the Hagia Sophia, the two buildings facing each other across a garden like representatives of different centuries having a conversation that will never end. The Hagia Sophia, 15 centuries old, both of them standing, both of them functioning, both of them testifying to the same human impulse to build something that outlasts the builder. The ferries cross the Bosphorus every few minutes, carrying commuters between Europe and Asia, a daily transit between continents that the people of Istanbul treat with the casual familiarity of people who have been doing this for 26 centuries. The water is the same water. The strait is the same strait. The currents that carried the fish and the trade ships and the warships and the Greek fire still flow. At sunset, if you stand on the Galata Bridge and look south toward the old city, you can see what Bizas saw, what Constantine saw, what Mehmed saw from the deck of his flagship. The domes and the minarets against the sky, the water turning gold, the silhouette of a place that has been continuously inhabited for longer than almost any other city on the planet. A place that has absorbed 26 centuries of human effort and human violence and human beauty and has converted all of it into layers, into strata, into the accumulated depth of a place that cannot stop being important because the geography will not let it. The call to prayer still sounds from the minarets of the Hagia Sophia. The building has been a church for 900 years, a mosque for 500 years, a museum for 86 years, and is now again a mosque. The mosaics, uncovered during the museum period, the faces of Christ and the Virgin that had been hidden under Ottoman plaster for centuries, are still there, still visible, still looking down from the walls of a building that is now again a place of Islamic worship. The layers remain, Roman beneath Byzantine, beneath Ottoman beneath modern. Christian beneath Muslim, beneath secular, beneath Muslim again. Each layer resting on the last, each layer containing the remains of the people and the cultures and the faiths that lived here before, each layer adding something to the total that the next layer inherits and transforms and passes on. The city that was the world 3 times is still a city, still inhabited, still argued over, still coveted, because the geography has not changed and the water does not stop flowing and the promontory does not stop being what it has always been. The blind are still building on the wrong side of the strait. The promontory is still there. It has always been there. The last emperor of Constantinople was named Constantine. This is the kind of coincidence that history produces occasionally, the kind that a novelist would be criticized for inventing, because it is too neat, too symmetrical, too obviously meaningful. The first Christian emperor, the man who built the city, was Constantine. The last Christian emperor, the man who would die defending it, was Constantine. Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, the last ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, the last man to hold the title that Augustus had first assumed 15 centuries before. He knew what was coming. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II had been preparing since he took the throne in 1451, at the age of 19. He was young and ambitious and possessed of a particular quality that distinguished him from previous sultans who had contemplated taking the city, a quality that might be called strategic imagination, the ability to see not the reasons it had always failed, but the specific combination of circumstances that might make it succeed this time. He built a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, north of the city at the narrowest point of the strait. Rumeli Hisari was constructed in less than 5 months, an extraordinary feat of military engineering that served notice that the strait was now under Ottoman control. He commissioned a cannon. The cannon was built by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to Constantine XI and had been turned away because the Byzantine treasury could not afford his price. The cannon that Orban built was 27 feet long and could fire a stone ball weighing over half a ton. It was the largest gun in the world. It could fire only 7 times a day because the barrel required hours of cooling between shots, and it could, from a distance of a mile, strike the walls of Constantinople with a force that no medieval fortification had been designed to withstand. The walls had been built to resist catapults and battering rams. Orban's cannon applied a force of a different order of magnitude at a distance beyond the range of the defenders' weapons, through a technology that the walls builders could not have imagined. The siege began on April 6, 1453. Mehmed arrived with an army estimated between 80,000 and 200,000 men. Constantine XI had roughly 7,000 defenders, 7,000 men to hold 4 miles of land wall and 14 miles of seawall against an army that outnumbered them by a factor of 10 or 20 or possibly more. The disparity was not new. Constantinople had always been defended by small garrisons against large armies. The walls had always compensated. That was what the walls were for. But the cannon was new. The bombardment began on April 12th. The stone balls struck the walls with a force that cracked the limestone facing, pulverized the rubble fill behind it, and opened breaches that the defenders worked frantically to repair during the nights between bombardments. The walls that had held for 1,000 years were being dismantled section by section by a technology that rendered their design philosophy obsolete. The defenders fought. 7,000 men held 4 miles of wall against an overwhelming force. For 53 days, repaired the breaches each night, manned the walls each day, fought off assault after assault with a tenacity that the Ottoman chroniclers themselves acknowledged with something approaching admiration. Mehmed tried something extraordinary. Unable to get his fleet past the chain blocking the Golden Horn, he had his ships dragged overland. Greased wooden tracks were laid across the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and the ships, dozens of them, were hauled out of the Bosphorus, pulled over the hill, and slid down into the Golden Horn on the city side of the chain. The defenders awoke to discover an Ottoman fleet in the harbour that had been chained shut against exactly this possibility. The pressure was now from every side. The 7,000 defenders were stretched to the point of breaking. Sleep was impossible. Relief was not coming. The appeals had gone out months before. Constantine XI had written to every Christian power in Europe, to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, to the kingdoms of France and England and Aragon. He had explained what was coming. He had described the Ottoman preparations. He had asked for help with the particular dignity and the particular desperation of a man who understood that what he was defending was not merely his own city, but the eastern frontier of an entire civilization. Some help came. Giovanni Giustiniani arrived from Genoa with 700 professional soldiers. His arrival was the single most significant reinforcement the city received. A handful of Venetian ships, some individual volunteers, a Spanish nobleman, a Scottish knight, the fragments of Christendom that were willing to show up when Christendom as a whole was not. 7,000 against at least 80,000. The mathematics of the defense were impossible, but the walls existed precisely to make impossible mathematics survivable. Every section of the 4-mile land wall was assigned to a specific commander and a specific contingent. Constantine himself commanded the section near the gate of St. Romanus, where the ground was lowest and the cannon bombardment was heaviest. The days blurred into each other. Bombardment during the daylight hours, the great cannon firing 7 times daily, each shot announced by a thunderclap that could be heard across the Bosphorus, each ball striking the wall with the force of something that the ancient builders could not have conceived. Then darkness, and the frantic repair work, the women and the old men and the children, filling the breaches with earth and timber and rubble and whatever else could be found to fill the gaps that the cannon opened each day and that human hands closed each night. The defenders ate what they had. Food was limited. The Ottoman fleet controlled the approaches, and the supply situation inside the walls was deteriorating week by week. Water was available from the cisterns, the underground reservoirs that the Byzantine engineers had built for exactly this kind of emergency. But food was another matter. There was not enough, and every evening from the Ottoman camp, the sounds of celebration and prayer drifted across the open ground. The sounds of an army that knew it was winning, that could see the walls crumbling and the breaches widening and the defenders thinning, that could count the days remaining by the rate at which the stone was being consumed, by the cannon, the way you count the hours of a candle by watching it burn down. The moon was dark. An eclipse in the final week had taken the moon from the sky, and the defenders, who had been raised in a tradition that read cosmic events as messages from God, understood the dark moon as they understood the fallen icon and the strange fog and the light on the dome. The signs were consistent. The signs were saying the same thing. The protection was withdrawing. The end was approaching. The 1,000 years were closing. Inside the churches, the priests continued the services. The liturgy continued. The candles continued to burn in front of the icons. The particular rhythm of Orthodox worship, the chanting and the incense, and the steady progression of the hours of prayer that had structured the religious life of the city for 9 centuries, continued to operate even as the walls outside were crumbling, even as the cannon thunder shook the buildings, even as the gap between the divine protection that the liturgy invoked and the physical reality that the walls could not prevent grew wider with each passing day. This is the thing about Constantinople that the purely military narrative of its fall does not capture. The city was not just a fortress, it was a place of worship. The defense of the walls and the continuation of the liturgy were not separate activities. They were the same activity, experienced at different registers, the physical and the spiritual expressions of the same refusal to accept that what had been built here was finished. The men on the walls were defending the churches. The priests in the churches were praying for the men on the walls. The city was holding itself together through both kinds of force simultaneously, the force of stone and the force of faith, and when both gave way on the same morning, the collapse was total. On the night of May 28th, Mehmed ordered a final assault for the following morning. The city knew. By the final days of May, everyone inside the walls understood what was coming. The breaches in the wall near the gate of St. Romanus were being repaired each night, but the repairs were improvised, temporary stockades of earth and timber that could not withstand the kind of sustained assault that 53 days of observation had taught the defenders to expect. The food was nearly gone, the ammunition was running low, the manpower was stretched so thin that some sections of the wall were defended by a single row of men standing shoulder to shoulder with gaps between them. Omens appeared, or rather, the people of a deeply religious city in extremis interpreted everything as an omen, because when the rational mind has exhausted its resources, the mind that preceded the rational takes over. The icon of the Virgin Mary, carried in procession along the walls as it had been carried during every siege in the city's history, was dropped. It fell from the hands of the bearers and struck the ground, and the crowd that witnessed it understood the fall as a message, a withdrawal of the divine protection that had sustained the city for 1,000 years. A strange fog settled over the city in the final days. Fog was unusual in May. The fog was interpreted. An unearthly light was seen playing around the dome of the Hagia Sophia, a reddish glow that witnesses described as flame without heat, and this too was interpreted as the departure of the Holy Spirit from the building it had inhabited for 9 centuries, as God leaving the city before the city fell. Whether these phenomena were real, or remembered, or invented by chroniclers writing after the fact, their presence in the accounts tells us something about the psychological state of the defenders in the final days. They were exhausted, they were hungry, they were watching the walls crumble and the enemy multiply, and the relief that had been promised failed to arrive. They were people who had been raised in a tradition that understood history as the unfolding of divine will, and the divine will appeared to be withdrawing from them, and the only response available was the response that their tradition provided, which was prayer. Inside the city, Constantine XI attended a final liturgy at the Hagia Sophia. The church was full. Orthodox and Catholic worshippers together, the theological divide set aside for one night, one service, one last act of communal prayer in the building that had been the spiritual center of the Christian East for 900 years. The service ended, the emperor left the church and went to the walls. The final assault began in the early hours of May 29th. Mehmed sent his forces in waves. The first wave was expendable irregulars, intended to exhaust the defenders. The second wave was Anatolian regulars. The third wave was the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army. The defenders held against the first wave. They held against the second wave. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, who had been the tactical leader of the defense, was wounded during the second wave and carried from the wall. His departure had a demoralizing effect that the Ottoman commanders noticed and exploited. The third wave came. The Janissaries advanced in disciplined formation, fresh and unexhausted, against defenders who had been fighting for hours and sleeping in fragments for weeks. A small group of Ottoman soldiers found a gate. The Kirko Porta, a small postern gate, had been left open or inadequately secured. The soldiers entered. They reached the top of the wall. They raised the Ottoman standard. The sight of the enemy flag on the wall broke the defense. The organized resistance that had held for 53 days dissolved. Constantine XI was last seen fighting near the gate of St. Romanus. He is reported to have said, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive," and to have charged into the Ottoman advance. His body was never identified with certainty. By mid-morning, on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople was in Ottoman hands, the city that had been the capital of the Roman Empire for 1123 years, the city whose walls had held the world at bay for 1,000 years, was finished. The date was a Tuesday. In the Greek world, Tuesday has been considered an unlucky day ever since. Tonight, somewhere between waking and sleep, consider the walls, not the specific walls, not the Theodosian walls with their moats and their killing grounds and their 40-foot inner ramparts. Any walls, the walls of whatever building you are in right now, the walls that separate the inside from the outside, the private from the public, the space where you rest from the space where the world happens. Every wall is an act of faith. Every wall says, what is inside here is worth protecting. Every wall assumes a future, assumes that the thing it encloses will still be here tomorrow, assumes that the effort of building is justified by the expectation of duration. The people who built the walls of Constantinople assumed 1,000 years. They got 1,000 years. They got exactly what they built for. What they did not build for, what no wall can protect against, is the change that makes the wall itself obsolete. The cannon that fires from a distance the wall's builders could not have imagined. The betrayal that comes from the direction the wall was not facing. The slow decay that happens inside the walls, while the walls themselves still stand. Constantinople's walls held for 1,000 years, and then they did not. The thing that defeated them was not stronger than the things that had failed to defeat them. It was different. It operated by different principles. It came from a direction that the wall's designers could not have anticipated, because the technology that made it possible had not been invented when the walls were built. This is the story of every wall. Eventually, always, something arrives that the wall was not designed for. The wall holds and holds and holds, and then it does not. And the thing that breaks it is never the thing that all the previous holding was practiced for. It is the new thing, the thing from outside the frame. But the wall still mattered. The 1,000 years mattered. The civilization that grew behind the walls mattered. The art and the law and the architecture and the literature and the religious tradition that developed in the shelter of the stone mattered. The Hagia Sophia mattered. The Corpus Juris Civilis mattered. The manuscripts that were copied and preserved and transmitted to the future mattered. The people who lived their lives inside the walls, who were born and married and worked and raised children, and grew old and died in a city that felt permanent because the walls made it feel permanent. They mattered. The wall did not have to last forever to have been worth building. It only had to last long enough for the things inside it to take root. They took root. The legal system of modern Europe grew from seeds preserved inside those walls. The art of the Renaissance was influenced by artists who fled Constantinople when the walls fell, carrying techniques and traditions they transplanted into Florence and Venice and Rome. The theological traditions of Eastern Christianity survived because the walls held long enough for them to become self-sustaining. The classical texts that the Byzantine scholars preserved survived because the walls gave them a place to survive in. The wall was the condition for everything that grew behind it, not sufficient by itself, not the source of the civilization, but the necessary precondition, the sheltering structure that made the growing possible. The way a greenhouse is not the plant, but is the reason the plant survives the winter. Think about what survived the fall. When the walls came down in 1453, the scholars fled. They carried manuscripts, they carried the knowledge of 1,000 years of continuous intellectual tradition, the Greek philosophy and the Roman law and the Christian theology that had been preserved and copied and debated and refined behind those walls, while the rest of Europe forgot how to read them. They carried this knowledge west, to Italy, to the courts and the universities that were just beginning to stir with the impulse that would become the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople seeded the rebirth of the West. The ending became a beginning. The loss became a transmission. This is the thing about walls. They are temporary. All walls are temporary. The question is never whether the wall will hold forever, because it will not. The question is whether it will hold long enough for the things inside to grow strong enough to survive without it, long enough for the seeds to germinate and the roots to deepen and the plant to become capable of enduring the winter on its own. Constantinople's walls held long enough. 1,000 years was long enough. The civilization that grew behind them became strong enough, deep-rooted enough, widespread enough, that when the walls finally fell, the civilization did not fall with them. It scattered, it dispersed, it found new soil and new shelter and continued growing in 100 different places, carrying with it the memory of the dome and the light and the city that had been the world. The dome is still there. Go to Istanbul, stand in the nave of the Hagia Sophia and look up. The dome is still floating on its ring of light, still doing what the Anthemius and Isidore designed it to do 15 centuries ago. still making the air seem to glow, still producing in visitors the response that Procopius described, the response that the ambassadors of the Rus described, the response that every person who stands beneath it and looks up has always had and will always have, which is the response of the human being in the presence of something that exceeds the human scale and that was built by human hands. The mosaics look down, Christ Pantocrator in the gallery, the Virgin and Child in the apse, the faces that were covered with Ottoman plaster and uncovered in the 20th century, and that now gaze across a space that has been a church and a mosque and a museum and a mosque again. Faces that have watched the layers accumulate and the names change and the faiths alternate and the one constant persist, which is the building itself, the stone and the light and the space that contains them. The argument about what civilization is for, that Justinian made in 532, and that has not been refuted. The walls crumbled, the empire fell, the name changed, the faith that worshipped beneath the dome changed, but the dome did not fall. The dome held, the dome is still holding, and the thing that the dome contains, the space and the light and the human experience of standing inside something that is too large and too beautiful to have been made by human hands, and that was made by human hands, that thing has not changed either. It is the same experience today that it was in 537. That is what the walls protected. That is what 1,000 years of defense was for. Not the empire. The empire fell. Not the faith in its specific institutional form. The faith changed, not the population. The population was replaced. What survived was the thing itself, the building, the space, the light, the human capacity to stand inside something extraordinary and feel something that ordinary life does not provide. That survived. That is still there. Consider the walls you are inside right now. They are protecting something, whatever it is. Your rest, your safety, your ability to close your eyes and let the thinking slow and let the day recede and drift toward whatever kind of sleep is coming. The walls are doing what walls do, holding the outside out and the inside in and creating, in the space between, the conditions under which the fragile things can happen. Rest, thought, dream. Constantinople was founded 26 centuries ago on a promontory where the waters of the Black Sea narrow into a strait so strategically positioned that an oracle called the people on the other side, blind for not seeing it. It was rebuilt by an emperor who put his name on it and moved the center of the world. It was fortified with walls that held for 1,000 years against every army the medieval world could produce. It was crowned with a dome that floated on light and that made visitors weep, and that stands today 15 centuries later, still the most important building in the city. It was betrayed by its allies and conquered by its enemies, and renamed by its new rulers, and rebuilt and repopulated, and continued layer upon layer, century upon century, name upon name, empire upon empire. Faith, it is still there. The promontory is still there. The water is still there. The strait is still the strait. The geography that made it valuable before there was a city has not changed and will not change. The call to prayer sounds at sunset. The light on the water turns gold. The city that was the world 3 times continues, as it has always continued, as it will continue, because the geography does not change, and the water does not stop being the most strategically perfect city site on the surface of the earth. The blind are still on the other side. The walls, what remains of them, still stand. And inside the walls, where you are now, behind whatever walls are holding the outside out tonight, the fragile things are happening. The rest, the quiet, the slow loosening of the mind's grip on the day, the gradual release of attention into the drift of something softer, something that does not require walls or armies or the strategic perfection of geography, but only the permission to stop. For now, and let the current carry you, let it carry you. The city sleeps. It has been sleeping and waking for 26 centuries, and it will sleep and wake again tomorrow. Sleep well.